Okay, welcome to the Sunday Symposium. This is the last symposium for 2020, and our first symposium in 2021 will be on protecting ocean wildlife on January 10th. And beginning with that one, we go back to a modified version of our old format. At 10:30, we will have a live lecture, and then following the lecture, we will have the Q&A. So that's what we will begin. You'll see that in your December 15th issue of the Oakmont News, which those of you in Oakmont should be keeping your eyes open for. Our speaker today is Dr. Kayleen Asbo, a beloved speaker here in Oakmont. A great many of us have taken courses from her, and she combines the sense of, I will call it poetry for lack of a better term, with the sense of music. And we had a delightful lecture. And at the end of the lecture, she hinted that she has a course coming in January. So I'm going to ask the first question by asking Kayleen to tell us a moment or two about the course she has coming up next month.
Thank you. And let me just say good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be spending this Sunday with you. And I just want to point out that on my green screen behind me is an image of the Rhine River that Beethoven loved so much. So I thought it was interesting, George, that you said that your next speaker is all about wildlife and how important nature was to Beethoven. That's something we can circle around to later. But during this time of lockdown, I have actually, do I want to say a Zoom junkie? I teach between 3 to 5 classes a week on Zoom, some through my own organization and some in partnership with people in England and Canada and Virginia and all over the world. So if you're interested, I'll highlight specifically two courses that I think might be particularly of interest to you if you are a classical music lover and a Beethoven lover for one of them. And you can find out all the information. I'm going to do just a screen share so that everybody can see this. If you look up my name, Kayleen Asbo, you'll find my website. And this is what it looks like on the home page. And on the first page here, you'll see all of the upcoming events that are happening. So right now I'm doing a class on Hildegard and Carl Jung. I've done things on Dante, I'll be doing virtual pilgrimages. And then, this one is particularly appropriate for our times with an organization in Ireland called the Abbey of the Arts. I'll be doing an intensive 3-day retreat called the Way of the Hermit, which is a spiritual survival guide for us essentially during lockdown. I did the first version of this in March. And that looks across time at people like everything from Pythagoras to Francis of Assisi and how they managed to not just survive times of lockdown, but thrive.
Kayleen, I'm going to put you on hold for one moment. I think I need to put people on mute.
Okay.
Okay, so I put people on mute and I have to get you off of mute.
Okay.
Or actually, you can unmute yourself. Can you unmute? Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
Are you back on?
The class that I'll be teaching beginning on January 12th, that's particularly, I almost want to say it's like a sequel to my little talk today, is if you go up at the top of my webpage here and you see where it says online classes, and there's a drop-down menu here and it says T.S. Eliot and Beethoven. And that course right here is, got a typo in the title, but it is The Mystic Path of T.S. Eliot. And the second of the 6-week series focuses on how T.S. Eliot's greatest poetic masterpieces were inspired by Beethoven's quartets, the pieces that he wrote when he was completely deaf, the opus 127, 130, 131, 32, 33, 35, but especially this string quartet in A minor. And it's one of the great revelations of my life that I never would have discovered if I hadn't been equally steeped in literature and music to understand the cross connections. And so if you don't know those 4 quartets poems by T.S. Eliot, they are so sublime. And one of the concluding lines is a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And he was referencing the slow movement of the quartet in A minor, Opus 132, that Beethoven wrote when he was just, I spoke about this in the lecture, about when he was just absolutely emotionally devastated, but he had broken his heart open and wrote this music of such sublime grace. So that will be the 6-week class, and Santa Sabina has allowed me the great joy to offer Oakmont a special group rate. So I think George is going to help me get that news out to you, and you can join in that class that starts on January 12th. It's Tuesday mornings from 10:30 to noon. And the other thing I'll be doing online with Santa Sabina, I don't know if some of you might know, because he originated his career in Sonoma, the most extraordinary violinist, Nigel Armstrong. And Nigel Armstrong and I will be doing feast day celebrations of great composers. And we'll be going actually to the chapel of Santa Sabina and filming music in that incredible chapel, and then weaving that together with a story of the composer's life. So first up will be Mozart and Schubert at the end of January, and then we'll have a Bach extravaganza in March for Bach's birthday. So if you want to stay up to date on that, I'd love to have you join my email list. I send out reflections with links to music and poetry about once a week. Through the company I started, Mythica, and then you can know about all the classes, and it would be a great joy to see you there at some of them.
Okay, now we're open for questions from anyone here. You can unmute yourself, or I can unmute you, and you can either do that by saying you want to type something in the chat, including the question, or just that you want to ask a question, or raise your hand. And usually we can spot it if you even physically raise your hand. Is that Jeff Schiff with his hand up? Jeff, if you wanted to ask your question, you're on.
Okay. Can you hear me, Kayleen?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Locally, you know, we have the Valley of the Moon people, and they use period instruments. And Eric Zivian has been giving Sunday concerts of all of Beethoven's piano sonatas. My question is this, listening, and they're very good, and he's very good, but listening to them, I have an increased respect for the modern piano and its power in producing some of these symphonies. Do you have any comments on using original instruments for Beethoven?
Oh, yes, I would be happy to speak to this. I mean, it's a very interesting and controversial issue. You'll find musicians who are passionate on both sides. And for those of you who may not be familiar with what Jeff was talking about, the piano that Beethoven grew up on was quite different than our modern piano. It was much lighter. You know, you could lift it and carry it on your shoulders with two people. The white keys were black, the black keys were white. The keyboard itself was very narrow, and the sound was much lighter. It's sort of almost tinkly. So it's a very, very different sound for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And it was such a lightweight instrument that Beethoven, on his debut, when he was a child and he did a debut concert, he broke 3 of the strings because he played with such passion and such power. So I would say that, you know, if you contrast, for example, Mozart on the fortepiano and Beethoven on the fortepiano, it's a very interesting contrast. Beethoven, for me, was always bursting out of the bounds. He literally wrote pieces occasionally where he indicated notes that didn't yet exist on his piano. He forced the instrument makers to push themselves to the limit. He wrote things without any concern about how hard they were for people. And that's very different than Mozart, who was constantly adapting to the circumstances. So personally, what I would say is that I think that if Beethoven had had a 9-foot grand Steinway at his disposal, he would have picked that instrument, that would have been what he wanted to play with, because he always wanted his instrument to be louder and softer, more contrast, greater intensity. I have no doubt that he would have picked a Steinway over a fortepiano. That said, there's something really important about this movement that's known as, the historical performance practice movement, to know and understand the context in which a work was created. And when I was a graduate student at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, I studied performance practice for 2 years of Baroque performance practice up through the Age of Enlightenment, or so-called classical style, with Laurette Goldberg and others there. And it was invaluable to understand, how should you phrase things? What did the music mean? What, for example, in the case of Bach, every key has a symbol. It doesn't just mean, B minor isn't just B minor. B minor is death and desolation, as opposed to C minor, which has a very different quality to it. So understanding the context, I think, is essential. And I know that Eric is a great scholar of those things and communicates some of that beautifully to people, and that's very important. That said, Jeff, almost always I'm with you about the piano. I would say, however, that somebody who I think does a brilliant job at being guided by the understanding of historical performance practice and allowing for some modern adaptation that is in the spirit of those composers is my favorite conductor in the world, John Eliot Gardner. And John Eliot Gardner's recordings and videotapes of Beethoven symphonies are not to be missed, because what he does is he has gone so deeply into that. What was the oboe that Beethoven used in his symphony orchestra? What was the balance with the upper strings and the lower strings? That I think he has just the most incredible scholarly approach to it, at the same time that he has the most intense and ardent passion. And I think that both of those things are essential for the best kind of performance.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
That was beautiful. Many years ago, we lived in Boston, and the Fine Arts Museum had a collection of period instruments, and would periodically run concerts on the period instruments of period times.
Oh, it's fascinating to do that. When I was, I led a pilgrimage tour last September in Scotland in the footsteps of Felix Mendelssohn. And we went to St. Cecilia's Hall, which is where Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann performed and brought the music of Bach and Beethoven for the first time. And they had a museum that had a fortepiano that Mozart had played on. They had instruments that Bach's sons had played on. And I got to, go around and perform on all of those instruments, which was just a great delight. And yet, that said, I can make a much better case for playing Mozart on the fortepiano than Beethoven. And it just goes right back to him being, as a child, he wanted a bigger instrument. He wanted a louder sound. That's why he broke the strings. And so let's do it in the spirit of what he would have wanted, because that's how he heard the music in his head. And of course, that's the only way that he could have kept composing being deaf, is that he heard the music in his head. And it was like the world hadn't quite caught up to his imagination. But I think we have now with the piano. I think that he would sit down at the piano and be thrilled. I don't think he would play the electric keyboard, but I think he would play a Steinway Grand for sure, or a Fazioli.
Okay, Lynn?
Kayleen, you talked in your presentation to us about him being unlucky in love.
Mm-hmm.
And just prior to starting the Q&A, you were talking about him finding solace in nature.
Oh.
Can you talk about his habits, his lifestyle? What
Sure.
like?
Yeah. Well, I think he was, I would say, characterize him as a difficult and eccentric friend. And one of the ways that I would describe him is that outwardly he would have bursts of mercurial temper tantrums. But inside it was like he was this gooey, sweet thing, so he had this incredibly tender heart that surrounded by habits and behaviors that were inflammatory and often streaked with anger. So a couple of stories about this. And then I'll get to like his consolation piece. So he had such poor hygiene habits at one point that his friends were embarrassed to be in public with him because he wouldn't bathe or wash his clothes. And one of the famous stories is that while he was asleep in the dead of night, they convinced the landlady to let them in, and they got his clothes and they took them and washed them and then brought them back. And he was so oblivious to that because he was so in his imagination that I don't think he even noticed that that was the case. You know, if he got an idea when he was, you know, out at a meal, there's this one famous story where he suddenly was seized by inspiration. And he took his shirt and he began writing the music on his shirt sleeve and on the tablecloth. So he didn't follow social conventions. He had a streak of impatience and anger inside of him. So one famous story is the waiter brought cold soup to him and he picked it up and he threw it at him. And of course, then he was often overcome with remorse afterwards, like, oh, I can't believe I did that. Maybe you all have somebody in your own life who acts out of anger and then they're repentant. And well, that was Beethoven. He was always writing I'm sorry letters to people. But despite being so difficult in that way, he had such a profound depth of soul that, you know, that his friends really did love him, even despite all of those things, because he had a poetic soul. You know, he was a great reader. And actually one of the surprises, you know, after he started going deaf in his 30s, this is an age without hearing aids. So this might be new information for some of you. We have half of a lot of the conversations with Beethoven. And we have half of it because there's something called the notebooks, the conversation notebooks. And because he couldn't hear, his friends would write down their questions, their thoughts, and he would answer. We don't have what he said, but we have one half of the conversation. And we know then that he was really, from the time he was very young, he was drawn to a whole movement in Germany about looking to find sort of this Neoplatonic idea of what is good and true and beautiful and how to bring that out. So poetry and philosophy and mythology, all of those were deeply important to him. And he had quite a library that he would turn to in the readings of sacred texts in order to help guide him. But without a doubt, the most important consolation of his life was nature. And from the time he was a little boy, you know, you get a glimpse of this in the film that was made a couple of decades ago with Gary Oldman in it as Beethoven, the film Immortal Beloved. You know, there's this scene that's just so heartrending of when his father is coming up the stairs with a switch to beat him and a drunken stupor. Beethoven, the little boy, climbs out the window and he runs into the woods and he lays in the lake and he looks up at the stars. And while that specific moment was an invention for that particular narrative, which is the culmination of the Ninth Symphony, it captured something deeply true, that for Beethoven, nature was profoundly important. In fact, you might even consider him what's called a panentheist, like Goethe, that he saw the divine in every tree, in every rock, in every plant, and the woods were what nourished him. So when he knew that he was going deaf and he was struggling with suicide, he actually took himself off into the woods near Heiligenstadt. And he would walk for hours and hours and hours in nature. And that was, I really think that was the only thing that held him together for years at an end. And we see how much he loved nature, but when we look at the Sixth Symphony, in which he's trying to put into sound in the Pastoral Symphony what he heard in his daily walks. And if you actually go into parts of Germany, there are Beethoven nature walks that you can take, where we know his pathway that he did, his pathway of inspiration, where he wrote down bird song, you know, as the birds that he heard in that particular place. We know what meadows he was in when he was inspired by the meadows for the meadow movement. And nature for him was what consoled his broken heart again and again and again, when all of his human relationships were deeply flawed and disappointing at best and heartbreaking at worst.
Kayleen, as a longstanding opera buff, Fidelio has always been a funny kind of opera in the historic pattern.
Yep.
Okay, it doesn't quite fit any place historically.
No.
Okay, and to some extent, I don't see that it actually fits any place within Beethoven. What is your feeling about Fidelio?
Oh, well, I have to say about Fidelio, I agree with you that it's sort of an outlier that way. Unlike Mozart, who was what I would call a natural opera composer, it just flowed effortlessly from him. Beethoven really struggled with the limitations of the genre. He struggled with the human voice in a lot of ways. A lot of singers will tell you, for example, the sopranos that I know hate singing the Ninth Symphony because it pushes them to the limit, and it actually can hurt their voices. That what Beethoven was hearing inside of his imagination doesn't necessarily take into account human capacities and limitations. That said, the opera Fidelio, for those of you who don't know it, is really interesting for a number of reasons. He struggled, we can see his struggle with it because he rewrote the overture over and over and over again. And so the third overture, the Lenore third overture, is far more popular, I think, than the opera itself. As a symphonic work, it works really well. You can see how Beethoven's such a symphonic composer. I love the opera from a psychological perspective, though. The idea of this cross-dressing heroine who goes into the dungeon to liberate her beloved husband. I think next year I might teach a whole Jungian-oriented class on that. So in a nutshell, personally what I feel, I will just say, and people of course will disagree with this, and that's fine. But I feel like Beethoven really came into understanding how to write the human voice strangely at the end of his life with Mrs. Solemnis, and then with the song cycle that he wrote, the very first song cycle, To the Distant Beloved, which is just, I put that on your recommended reading list. To me, that is just, that became the beacon of inspiration for Schubert and Schumann and Brahms and all the romantic composers of how do you tell a unified story through text with a singer that takes us on an emotional journey that, by the way, is steeped in nature as well. And so that worked. For me, that work is where Beethoven really comes into his genius, that in the Missa Solemnis as a vocal writer.
Okay.
So that's my answer, George.
Judy?
Well, and what piece was that again?
To the Distant Beloved.
To the Distant Beloved, okay.
I'm going to bungle the German pronunciation, but ein fern geliebt. As somebody who speaks German will say that much better than I do. Yeah.
Also, you talked about how his father made him the bread, earning the living for the family.
Yeah.
How was that done? You don't take your piano down to the street corner and put your hat out.
Well, kind of he did, actually. It's interesting when you look at this isn't the case in particular with Beethoven, but Mozart, for example, took his two children on extensive tours, Leopold Mozart, and he would go to the local pub in London and put out a side book show, one of those cakeboard walks, a sign that's basically said, on display today to Wunderkind, and people would come. But with Beethoven, what happened is the man that I spoke about, Neef, his teacher, he got him a position as an assistant organist so that he was his second in command for the church in Bonn. So by the age of 13, Beethoven's salary as assistant organist was more than his father was making as a court singer, because his father was very erratic. He wasn't that great of a singer to start with. And then his drunken behavior, he was the town drunk. He was the town scandal, and he was unreliable. And so by that age of 13, that image that you all saw with him with those big saucer eyes, he was working as the assistant organist of a large cathedral.
We have a follow-up question, Kayleen, on Fidelio. We
Yeah.
have the rewrites for the overture.
Yeah.
Do we actually have any rewrites for the opera itself?
Oh, I am not enough of a Fidelio scholar that I could answer you that. Beethoven, my passion for Beethoven has really focused in my life on some of the piano works, quartets, and symphonies. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Okay. Well,
But if Mikhail is here, Pahir is here, he would know the answer. He's the opera aficionado par excellence in your Oakmont community. So are you here? I'm looking to see who might be here live. I don't see him,
No.
but one of your new residents knows everything. He goes around the world to opera performances. I would ask him.
okay, I know him separately. I haven't had a chance to do the opera thing with him.
Yeah.
In terms of influence, what did Wagner think of Beethoven?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. Well, Wagner would not have become a composer without Beethoven, but Wagner was an interesting fellow. Unlike virtually any other composer, except perhaps Berlioz, Wagner did not start off as a performing musician. He wasn't a great pianist. He wasn't a great violinist. He wasn't himself a great singer. He was a great mind. And it was when he was a teenager, I believe it was the Seventh Symphony that he went to and he heard. And it was one of those encounters that shook him to his core and shaped his life. And after that, he's like, I'm going to be a composer. And he never stopped studying Beethoven. So what Beethoven does in terms of a very specific thing here called motivic development. We see this most explicitly in the Fifth Symphony, where he takes just that short little motif, and then he takes that idea and it becomes a seed kernel in which he develops the entire piece. Well, that inspired how Wagner composed, because Wagner took this idea then of having the orchestra have certain motifs that foreshadow the action in the opera and having particular motifs that are associated with different characters. Wagner made a piano transcription of the Ninth Symphony. It was partly their shared love of Beethoven that drew Franz Liszt and Wagner together. Both of them were champions of Beethoven's music. And if Liszt hadn't become Wagner's champion, Wagner would have simply died broke because nobody else in Europe for about 20 years would perform Wagner's music. So I feel very confident in saying there would be no Wagner, whether you love him or hate him, and people do both, but there would be no Wagner as a composer if there had not been Beethoven.
Okay. Jeff, you had another question. You want to ask that directly?
If you wish. How about the Kreutzer Sonata? I know Tolstoy wrote something on that, and I assume that you may be putting that in your class, but what do you think of the sonata, its history, its unusual story, and Tolstoy's writings?
Well, I think what I'm going to sort of talk a little bit around that and say that this is a great example of how Beethoven has inspired not just composers like Wagner and sort of been the trailblazer in new directions, but that the power of what Beethoven expresses in his music has also been a doorway of liberation, illumination, and inspiration to artists, painters, sculptors, but also poets and novelists. And so, Tolstoy's novel, in which he takes this violin and piano sonata and creates a story around it, shows how potent the music of Beethoven is for igniting the deepest emotions inside of us. And I would say sometimes the emotions inside of us that we may not be able to access any other way. One of the images that I had in my lecture was of the people in the salon, in the living room, listening to Beethoven play the piano. And there was one man who had his head down in his hands like this, shaking it, and the other one was back like this. Beethoven's music has a power to get into the deepest aspects of our psyche and to have us get in touch with the darkest emotions of terror and rage and fear, and the most brilliant, bright, and hopeful emotions. And ultimately, in that third period of music with the Ninth Symphony, with the string quartets and the late piano sonatas, to lead us to a place of harmony and healing. The Kreutzer comes from the middle period, the so-called heroic period of Beethoven's development, when you would characterize him as the angry man, the man who's defiant, who's shaking his fist at the world and at fate. And, you know, we can certainly hear some of the darkness and storminess in that piece that I think informed Tolstoy's imagination.
Okay. Other question? Juanita.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about his mother. I mean, obviously his father was a huge bad influence. Was his mother, I mean,
He loved his mother. He
Okay.
absolutely loved his mother. So Beethoven was the eldest of 3 children. There had actually been a child born before him who had died as a baby. And so if we put ourselves in that situation, imagining the second child after the first child is born, you can imagine all the love that might be lavished on it by a mother. And so he adored his mother, but she was very sick from the time he was a small child. You know, I think she had tuberculosis. So she, while she had a very tender heart, she was very ill. And because of that, you know, they didn't exactly have the resources, you know, to have nannies or to have they didn't have an extended family. So a lot of the time, Beethoven was really left to his own devices. And this is why nature was the great balm. You know, I think that if his mother could have, she would have been there for him. He loved her deeply. One of the interesting pieces, and certainly the biography that I would recommend to you, is by John Swafford, From Tragedy to Triumph. One of the interesting little notes is that Beethoven said that his favorite day of the year was the feast day of Mary Magdalene. And this caught my attention because that's my birthday. It's July 22nd is the feast day of Mary Magdalene. And his mother was named Maria Magdalena after Mary Magdalene. So German custom at that time was that you wouldn't celebrate your birthday. You would celebrate the birthday of the saint you had been named for if you were from a Catholic family. And he said that his favorite day of the year was this because it was the day that his mother was celebrated, that she had music and was given flowers and there was a social gathering. And if you read between the lines, I think it was like, it was the day that she was treated the best, you know, with this abusive alcoholic father. And that really touched my heart. I better get my handkerchiefs. I always cry when I talk about this episode of Beethoven's life, but one of the most dramatic chapters is he was sent off as a young man to Vienna by some patrons who sent him off with great fanfare and expectations to go meet Mozart. And the idea was that he was going to go study with Mozart. And there was this famous legendary meeting. But Beethoven was there for a very short period of time. The idea originally would be, you know, he'd be there for a year or two, or at least a couple of months. But he got a message almost immediately when he arrived there that his mother was dying. And so he dropped everything to rush back, all the opportunities that he could have had for fame and fortune and glory with these connections. He dropped everything to rush back to be, see, I've told you, I'm getting all clamped, to be there, to be at her bedside with her while she died. The next day, his father took all of his mother's clothes and sold them on the street in order to buy money to go to the tavern and buy beer. So I think that gives you a little bit of insight into the family dynamics, you know, and then Sigmund Freud and others of that ilk would have made an awful lot of the fact that the very first woman that he proposed marriage to, the singer who called him ugly and half crazy, that she had the same name as his mother. So there was a deep, 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 deep connection inside of him to his mother, and yet another one of those wounds. I mean, I imagine some of you do know what it's like to grow up with a mother who's very ill and who's wasting away, and being by her side. And all of that was part of Beethoven's tender psyche at the youngest age, at the same time he had this brutal alcoholic father.
Part of my interest in that question was I tried to understand what were the resources, and you mentioned nature, you mentioned his teacher. I mean, it's easy to see why he would be angry, and but what were the resources that allowed him to tap the other side of life?
There
keep going and produce.
That teacher, Christian Neef, the love of his mother, nature. There were some neighbors that took him in and even let him sort of sleep on the couch with them. And some of their eyewitness testimony about what he endured is what, really just broke me apart when I realized his father would come home, wake him up in the middle of the night, and what he would do to him. He was lucky enough, because of his teacher worked on his behalf to find patrons for him. And some of them did indeed become lifelong friends of Beethoven. They endured for decades as friends. But the other thing, and this is true for anyone I think who's listening, who's gone on to become a musician themselves, is that the music itself holds our broken heart. And just think of, I'd love to see you raise your hand and say, during this time of COVID, have you had an experience yourself where when you have been sad or depressed or afraid and you've put on some music, it's helped you in a way that words couldn't? Has anybody felt that experience? I'm seeing a few hands. For Beethoven, that was a daily experience. His teacher was one of the few people in Europe who had a complete collection of the Well-Tempered Clavier of Johann Sebastian Bach, which in a handwritten copy. And he gave it to Beethoven so that Beethoven knew all of those preludes and fugues by heart by the time he was 13. And when I taught a course on Bach for Oakmont, one of the things I said about that book, The Well-Tempered Clavier, is it should be called the Encyclopedia of Human Emotion, because every prelude and fugue takes us through a different psychological, emotional experience that goes from the depth of the deepest darkness to the most ebullient joy. And Beethoven knew that all. So I imagine, I like to imagine just the way that when I was a brokenhearted teenager, turned to Beethoven for my consolation. I imagine Beethoven as a brokenhearted young man pulling out the memories of his Well-Tempered Clavier and pouring his broken heart and getting inspiration from Bach. And I think that,
the ability to play all that in his head has had to.
And so that's what really held him. Music and nature and a few friends is what really held him in the darkness.
Kayleen, this may be an odd question, but hopefully not too odd. If you were a time traveler, and could go back to one point in time with Beethoven and ask him one sort of series of questions, when would you go back to, and what would you ask him?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm going to think about that for a minute, and I'm going to sort of answer a different way, which I've thought a lot about going back in time to Beethoven. But the place that I would go back to is Beethoven at the very end of his life, when he was on his deathbed and he was racked with pain. And in one of his conversation books and his journals, he writes two things that just really seized me. And one of them was that he said, "Thank God Beethoven can compose, for there is nothing else that he can do on this earth." And that he felt his whole life had been a failure. And what I would really want to do, and I say this in my lecture at the end, I did this with the Santa Rosa Symphony at the end of my lecture on the Ninth Symphony, is I would want to show him how deeply at the end of his life, how his music from his broken heart changed the world. And I would want to show him all of the composers that he influenced and helped through their dark times of the soul. I would want to read him the poems of T.S. Eliot that were inspired by his works, 150 years later. I would want to show him the Tiananmen Square with when those students were fighting for their liberty. They had the boombox that played the Ninth Symphony. I would want to show him that after 9/11, all throughout the world, when we had words that failed us, every major city in the world with a major symphony orchestra independently decided that they had to perform the Ninth Symphony, either for that very period or the anniversary of 9/11, because its message of universal brotherhood was so essential. And I would want him to know this. I would want him to die not just at peace, but feeling the honor due to him as someone who is a light of inspiration for all of us about how to take suffering and turn it into beauty. And then I would want to wrap him in my arms and give him a big kiss.
That more than answers my question. Roger, you had a question.
Yes, somewhat related to that answer. I was wondering, did Beethoven have any unfinished works in progress when he died?
Yeah.
And the second question, another question, did he write or ever attempt to write a Requiem?
I think the Missa Solemnis is the closest that we get to a Requiem. He was planning a 10th symphony. There were some very beginning sketches of that. There are assorted other scraps, if you will, of music. So most musicologists, it's so interesting to compare Beethoven and Schubert. Beethoven was Schubert's hero. Beethoven just knew about Schubert at the very end of his life. When he was in his deathbed, he was given some works of Schubert to look at. Schubert paid a visit to Beethoven in his final months. And Schubert was the pallbearer for Beethoven's funeral, and his dying wish was to be buried next to Beethoven, which he did receive that wish. I think Schubert knew more emphatically that the end was happening. I mean, when he writes the Swan Song and Stanchen and the last song cycle, he knew absolutely that this was it. And he was racing against the clock. Beethoven had had a couple of bouts in his life, not even, like 2 years before, when he wrote the Opus 132, and that middle movement of that string quartet, has that very long title that means the song of holy thanksgiving from a convalescent who has come through to the deity in the Lydian mode. But it was essentially this celebration of, I didn't die when I thought I would. And it may well have been that what was really the end, that until the very, very end, he thought, oh, this is another bout that I'm going to get through. But there were certainly sketches that he didn't. I mean, I really think that Schubert really, really, really knew. And I think that Beethoven, as tempting as it is to look at his very last work, the Opus 135, as this is in this script, it says, must it be, and then it must be. And you'll find that there are different scholars who take on that scrawl in the manuscript about what that means. But a lot of historians suggest that no, he had other plans that got cut short.
Lynn?
Oh, one of the things I heard, I need to verify this for sure, but one of the things I've heard is that he actually might have attempted to do another opera. Like both Mozart and Beethoven were tempted to do an opera based on Faust. And if I had one regret, it would be that opera didn't exist by Mozart or Beethoven. That would have been the most astonishing opera ever written by either one of them, I think.
Lynn?
So is it known what his cause of death was?
Yeah.
And what age he died? And was anybody around him? Do we know the circumstances?
Yeah, it's a really interesting death. There's actually a forensic book that is written called Beethoven's Hair. I have to confess, I haven't read it yet, but it's about how because famous people would often have a lock of their hair cut. And so we had several pieces of Beethoven's hair go out into the world. And then a few years ago, they were able to do an analysis of that. One of the things he was suffering from was cirrhosis of the liver. There was a whole collection of things that was there. Liver disease is one of them. There's all kinds of other things, that were part of the medical condition. In terms of other people around, yes, he had, amongst other people, one of the people was sort of one of his friends who would take dictation from him and do his errands and help him about was there. And strangely, I mean, this is a very interesting piece of a tidbit of life. And I like to imagine it one way. If you've seen the film Immortal Beloved, it's imagined a different way. But his brother's widow, the mother of the nephew that he had been in a court battle over custody with for years and years, which is one of the great tragedies of Beethoven's life, Johanna von Beethoven, came to him at the end of his life and was there. And my hope is that it really was a reconciliation, because between the two of them, and I think it was, because he then left unequivocal custody to her, where he had fought against her in the most horrific way for years and years before that. But I do like to imagine that being a deathbed reconciliation. But there were people. People came to visit Beethoven in his final months and final weeks. So he wasn't completely alone, but he was absolutely in agony and suffering greatly.
And given his liver disease, was he a drinker?
He was not a drunk the way his father was, but he did drink. He did drink. I think, I think the difference, he's certainly his familial disposition to alcoholism. If it hadn't have been for his music, I personally have no doubt that he would have been a chronic alcoholic. As it was, he was, I would classify him as a heavy drinker, but not an alcoholic.
Okay, Kayleen, I cannot thank you enough. You have an amazing way of integrating so many different things in the way you think and look at the world. And we truly appreciate your having taken the time with us.
Oh, thank you, George. It was a great pleasure. I hope I might have the joy of seeing some of you in the future for Beethoven and T.S. Eliot. And stay safe, stay well. Give yourself, I say, give yourself lots of vitamin B in the coming months, and that would be vitamin Bach and vitamin Beethoven and vitamin beauty in the days to come. And take inspiration. As I said, he is a hero for all time, but especially for whenever our world plunges into darkness. And in fact, if I might, I would love to read you to close a poem that I wrote about Beethoven, if that's all right with you.
Please.
And, let me just pull this up, because this is something that I was inspired to write shortly, actually, last year around the time. Okay. And it's called Ode to Joy. Those of you who know the Ninth Symphony, I want to invite you to just imagine the sounds of this in your head. It is possible that the apocalyptic rumors and reports are right, and that these might be the end times. But our ancestors from the past knew. They knew that relentless tragedy could also be the beginning of transformation. That it could become paint on a cave wall, song in a scarred throat, the drumming heartbeat of a dance of lamentation that would lead us to a deeper truth. I think of that long scream of terror that opens the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the cacophonous descent that signals the end of the world, and how the orchestra tries so valiantly to recapture the past, recapitulating one theme after another from the first three movements. And how each time the Greek chorus of the orchestra says, no, this will not do. We cannot go back to where we have already been. And then that moment when all seems lost in utter chaos and darkness, how slowly, tentatively, and ever so gently emerging from the soft underbelly of the strings is the simplest of tunes. Childlike, almost embarrassing in its utter transparency and open-hearted vulnerability. Yum bum ba dum, yum ba dee da 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 dee da. And how the goosebumps rise upon my neck as the melody begins its sure ascent, higher and higher until it blazes with triumph, blossoming into the ode to joy, shattering all notions of what a symphony should be, of what a symphony could be. And I wonder if Beethoven, gripped with liver disease and completely deaf, knew. I wonder if he knew as he flailed his swollen hands that his agony had opened the door to a new vision for the entire human race. And I imagine how his sad eyes would open wide with wonder if he could see his simple tune sung at Auschwitz, sung as Chinese students faced tanks in Tiananmen Square, if he could hear it sung at the fall of the Berlin Wall and see choirs all across the world after 9/11, uniting the world into his lifelong dream, a chorus of common shared humanity. How he would weep to know that in this time of darkness, when touch is forbidden, when we are locked in isolation, it is his notes that he could not even hear anymore that weave us together in loving embrace. So in his honor, let us sing with all that we have within us, no matter what storms rage all around. And let us know this in our bones. If a deaf and dying man who believed his whole life was a failure could give birth to such miraculous starshine as this, then surely there is still hope for us all.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic.